Tisha B'Av is characterized by Chazal as a day of Bechia Ladoros, as a day of tears. Indeed, the pasuk in Eicha, Bacho Tivkeh Balayla, reflects this theme as well. The double formulation hints at two different destructions, or the destructions of two different Batei Mikdash, which took place on the tragic day of Tisha B'Av. The Mishnah Masachet Tainis delineates numerous calamities that took place and that befell the Jewish people on this particular day. Mishnah says, Chamisha Dvarim Iru Es Avoseinu. There were 5 different things that took place on the day of Tisha B'Av. The Tisha B'Av Nigzar Lavoseinu Shalei Kansu La'aretz, the Charav Bayis Barishona Deshniya, the Nilka Da Beitar, the Nisrachsha Ha'ir. So, obviously, this is a day which is suffused with trauma, a day which obviously reaches a certain intense apex of tragedy in the Jewish calendar. Notwithstanding the depth or the intensity of the trauma of the day, one still might perceive this tragic anniversary exclusively within the framework of other established tzomos. After all, the pasuk in Zechariah, Perek Ches, quoted also very prominently, as we'll see in a moment, in the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, tells us that Tisha B'Av is simply referred to as Tzom HaChamishi, the fast day of the 5th month, just as Shivas B'Tammuz, for example, is characterized as Tzom HaRavi. The Mishnah in Tainus, which records all the events that took place on Tisha B'Av, equally records that Shivas B'Tammuz is a day in which the Jewish people suffered multiple calamities. Chamisha Dvarim Iru Es Avoseinu B'Shivas B'Tammuz, the Chamisha B'Tisha B'Av, comparing the two. B'Shivas B'Tammuz Nishtabra Haluchos, Batal HaTamid, Huvka Ha'ir, Saras Apustamos Es HaTorah, Hemed Selim Behechal, etc. So that on one level, we have numerous days of tragedy, which were terrible suffering for Klal Yisrael. Tisha B'Av is merely one of those. The Rambam Hilchos Tainis, Perek Hey, following this Talmudic pattern, also groups his treatment of Tisha B'Av together with other established tzomos. However, there is equal, if not greater, significant indications that Tisha B'Av is not merely the most severe of the tinios, but on certain level is qualitatively distinct and distinctive as well. The Gemara Masechet Rosh Hashanah Daf Yud Ches Amud Beis concludes that only Tisha B'Av among the tzomos remains obligatory, even in eras of relative prosperity, short of authentic peace, security, and harmony. Gemara says in Rosh Hashanah, just quoted very quickly, that Amar Rab Chana Bar Bizna Rab Shim Chasida Ma'itach Siv Kol Mar Shem Tzavakos Tzom Arvi Tzom Chamishi Tzom Shvi Tzom Asiri Yel Beisi Hudalas Sason L'Simcha Korelei Tzom Korelei Sasam L'Simcha Bizman Sheyesh Shalom, in a time of peace and harmony, Yul Sasan L'Simcha Ein Shalom Tzom. And then the Gemara adds Amar Papa Haki Kamar Bizman Sheyesh Shalom Yel Sasan L'Simcha Yesh Shmad Tzom Ein Shmad Ve'Ein Shalom. In a mixed era, Ratzu Misanin, Ratzu Ein Misanin. Fasting is voluntary. Ihachi, says the Gemara, Tisha B'Av Nami. Why isn't this true for Tisha B'Av as well? And the Gemara concludes, Amar Papa Shiny Tisha B'Av Hoil V'Huchbelu Bo Tzaros. Because it is a day of multiple tzaros, it's a particularly intense, tragic anniversary. Consequently, this is always observed absent full peace, harmony, and tranquility as a fast day. The Amar Mar B'Tisha B'Av Charev Abayis Barishona Ubishniya V'Nilkata Beitar V'Nechresha Ha'ir quoting the Mishnah in Titus. The Balitosis on the spot asks the obvious question. After all, we just noted that this Mishnah also counts equally 5 calamities that took place in Shivasu B'Tammuz. Tosa says, B'yom Shivasu B'Tammuz nani ira chamisha devarim, k'nitan b'perek basar tainis. Av l'churban beis hamikdash tekifa tuva, v'od lo dami l'tisha b'av d'tzara achas uchbelabo. Tosus makes 2 distinctions. Tosus suggests that Tisha B'Av is unique, number 1, in the intensity or significance of the loss, Tekifa Tuva, the loss of the Beis HaMikdash. Secondly, because of the double tragedy of 2 Batei Mikdash on the same day, that differentiates, that sets Tisha B'Av apart. And the question, of course, is, what do the Balei Tosis really mean by this? Do they mean that there's a quantitative difference between Tisha B'Av and Shivasu B'Tammuz, which justifies the special status of Tisha B'Av even in a more neutral era? Or more likely, are they suggesting that the repeated tragedy and the more intense loss of the Churban justifies Tisha B'Av's incomparable status as qualitatively a different kind of commemoration? Tisha B'Av's special status is reflected further by the fact that it has emerged as a focal point for the commemoration of other calamities in our history as well. This is demonstrated clearly by the range of the kinos that we include in the Tisha B'Av liturgy. Anybody who's familiar with the details of those kinos that we say every single year is struck by that historical and by the philosophical range of tragedies that we invoke on this day. Rashi in Divrei Hayamim, Divrei Yamim Beis, Perek Lamed Hey, Pasuk Chat Hey, notes this phenomenon as well. Commenting on the Pasuk in Divrei Hayamim, Vayikonen Yirmiyahu al Yoshiyahu, Vayomru Kol Hasharim V'Hasharos, B'kinosehem al Yoshiyahu ad hayom, Vayitnum l'chok al Yisrael v'inam ksuvim al hakinos. Rashi says, Vayitnum l'chok, kishem izdamin lahem shum tsar u'bechiyah. Whenever Klal Yisrael encounters pain and tears, shehem makonim u'bochim ala ma'orah, and that triggers a response of crying, of mourning what it is that took place, the event. Haym mazkirim zehatzar imo. Dugmas Tisha B'Av, shemazkirim kinos al harugim b'gzeiros she'iru b'yameinu, kein yivkiyun almos Yoshiyahu. Pasuk here means that the Misa of Yoshiyahu should be included with other tragedies. For the example, if Tisha B'Av is the framework for commemorating, acknowledging the national calamities of the Jewish people, that this would be included as well. Essentially, the controversy in our time over the proper way to observe and to commemorate the maybe greatest tragedy that has befallen our people, certainly since the Churban, and in terms of death and destruction, the Shoah, of course, whether Yom HaShoah should be an independent day or should be integrated and incorporated into Tisha B'Av, which was actually the Rav Zatzal's preference. This question of bundling it together with the rest or giving it separate expression focused very much on this idea of Tisha B'Av as a framework for national calamity. And while probably, for very good reason, policy-wise we do commemorate Yom HaShoah independently, the fact that we also compose kinos and include them in the Tisha B'Av liturgy, whether it's Rav Schwab's or the Bava Rebbe or other efforts to try to capture, something of the horrific, tragic loss. All of this is consistent with Rashi and Divrei Yamim. Some of the kinos, medieval kinos, speak about this explicitly as well. Tisha B'Av emerged not merely as a commemoration of the 5 calamities described in the Mishnah, but in addition, as kind of a moed, as we'll see in a moment, for acknowledging, identifying, empathizing with the tragedies that have taken place throughout Jewish history. Moreover, the singular character of Tisha B'Av is underscored by its numerous special halachot, and particularly the unusual and very suggestive mix of tzom. Gemara speaks about that in Tainus on Chav Zayin and Aleph, but equally of Aveilus. The Gemara in Tainus Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph, the Gemara in Yudvamos Mem Gimel Amud Beis, which speaks about, as we'll soon discuss a little more fully, the idea of Tisha B'Av as Aveilus Yeshana and Aveilus Derabim, the Aveilus of an ancient loss and a national loss, as opposed to Aveilus Chadasha, Shel Yachid. And, of course, the prayer of Nachem highlights this theme of Aveilus as well. The third element in the mix is the comparison to Yom Kippur, which we also find both in the Gemara in Tainus and especially in the Sugya and Makom Shenahagu in Psachim and Daf Nun Daled. Perhaps then the key to understanding the singular character of Tisha B'Av reflected by these phenomena that transcends simply its status as one of the tzomos that is described in Zechariah, dealt with in the Mishnah and Tainus and the Rambam and Hilchos Tainus, is to be found in Eicha's own description of the day as a kind of a moed, or as a moed of tragedy. Pasuk says in Eicha, Perek Aleph, Pasuk Tesvav, Kara alai moed lishbor bakurai. This formulation is responsible for the omission of Tachanun on Tisha B'Av, as well as other halachic nuances that on the surface are striking and surprising, in that we don't typically apply moed-esque characteristics to a day like Tisha B'Av. And while this formulation, can also be attributed to the fact that, like the other tzomos in Zechariah, in the future, we anticipate the time when each of those, and particularly Tisha B'Av, turns into a festival, as many of the poskim have explained, and therefore there's no Tisha B'Av, Tachanun in the present because of that anticipation. The fact that this is singular, and it doesn't apply to the other tzomos, and the formulation itself continued to be intriguing and curious. The fact is that all of these highlight Tisha B'Av's singular qualitative status. What do we mean by it, and what is the significance of it? The Rambam in Hilchos Tainus, Perek Aleph, Halacha Aleph through Gimel, and in Perek Hey, beginning with Halacha Aleph, emphasizes his view that Tainios in general, days of fasting, the commemoration of past calamities, are primarily intended as a catalyst for tshuva, what he calls midarke hatshuva, in one's present circumstances. The Rambam explains in Perek Aleph of Hilchos Tainus, Halacha Beis, Davar zeh midarke hatshuva hu shebizman shetavo tzara v'yizaku alel v'yariu yedu hakol shebiglal maseim aroim hura lahen kakasuv avonosechem hitu zeu sheyigroim lahasir hatzara me'aleha. Rama makes it very clear that the purpose of the tzom typically is to inspire us in the present, bidarke tshuva, to do tshuva. While the Rambam himself does not distinguish in this respect between Tisha B'Av and other tzomos, it is conceivable that Tisha B'Av, as a moed, as the anniversary of the double churban, the tekifus of the Aveilus of the Mikdash itself demands that we focus additionally on the irreparable loss that has been suffered by the nation. In other words, that in addition to the element of Midarkei HaTshuva, the commemoration of that day as the day, the anniversary of commemorating tragedies of Klal Yisrael, stands on its own. Hence, the strong expression of Aveilus Yeshana and Aveilus Derabim, as the Gemara describes it in Yevamos, Daf Mem Gimel Amud Beis, on this particular day. A parallel manifestation of mourning, or one of the other tzomos, a nachem, other nihugei Aveilus, would be inconceivable. Indeed, the very capacity to experience Aveilus Yeshana and Derabim itself is a remarkable phenomenon. These expressions are different than a personal and more contemporary or more immediate Aveilus, but the different expressions and manifestations themselves underscore both the challenge and the distinctive status of Tisha B'Av as a Yom of Avel. This day represents then something that is an opportunity for all Jews to identify with the history of the Jewish people and the devastation and the tragedies that occurred to different Jewish communities, as well as individuals who lived in those communities, those who suffered persecution and destruction throughout Jewish history. Like Yom Kippur, we'll get to Yom Kippur in just a minute, but like Yom Kippur, the yira and the pachad of Yom Kippur, the formidable sense of despair in the form of Aveilus Yeshana and Derabim and its tzom, also serves, in addition to an outlet of sadness and tragedy, as a positive catalyst to reaffirm and to focus on elemental core truths and principles about Jewish identity, empathy, and Ahavas Yisrael. In other words, the idea that we find in Chazal in general of being mishtatef b'tzarasan shel Yisrael, the Rambam in Perek Gimel Hilchos Tshuva codifies this as a prerequisite for proper Jewish identity and belief. Somebody who is not mishtatef b'tzarasan shel Yisrael, even if he's shomer kol shar mitzvos shabetorah, is somebody who's a min and an apikoros. This idea of being of a day in which we're mishtatef b'tzarasan shel Yisrael, a day in which we formulate through our tears, but also through our yearning and our hope, a sense of Ahavas Yisrael, is crucial to Jewish identity. Indeed, this identity, this empathy, this sense of responsibility is the yesod of Tisha B'Av. And for that reason, only Tisha B'Av remains obligatory in the absence of a climate of persecution, as the past focus continues to be highly relevant, not only for the past, but for the present, and for the inculcation of Ahavas Yisrael and that sense of national identity. Although Yud Zayin Tammuz was also a time of multiple sorrows, it was never established as anything but a catalyst, Midarkei HaTshuva, of repentance. Possibly this is what Balei Tosas meant. They intended to convey this idea by contrasting Tisha B'Av with Shivasar B'Tammuz by accentuating the fact that the Churban took place twice and the national symbol of the Mikdash as being something that was irreplaceable in Jewish life. Not merely to establish that Tisha B'Av was more, but that Tisha B'Av was singular, different, that it constitutes not only an outlet of our pain, but a national day of mourning, which is underpinned by the sense of loss that can only be triggered by a sense of Ahavas Yisrael for individuals and especially for Klal Yisrael. Indeed, like the joyous Moadim, which focus on a particular event or phenomenon in its own right, Tisha B'Av, the moed of national mourning, suffering, and identification, and Ahavas Yisrael, with the historical plight of the Jewish community, is a day that is complex, that is structured to reflect different facets of its important theme. Different stages of Aveilus are manifest during the day, Aveilus Yeshana Verabim, all of which highlight this idea, and that are conveyed by the various halachos. Like Yom Kippur, it is a day whose complexity provides a foundation for spiritual growth. And as noted earlier, like Yom Kippur, although a formidable, difficult day, it's a day of spiritual opportunity when you understand that the core motivation is the further identification with Klal Yisrael, its history, its nation, and its people. Indeed, Chazal tell us that Kol HaMesameach Chasam V'Kala Ki L'Bona Achas Michurvos Yerushalayim, because this too expresses the connection between Ahavas Yisrael and a sense of building the nation and commemorating the Churban. The most intense manifestation of Ahavas Yisrael, of course, is the marital relationship, She'oev Ishto Mechabdo Yoser Migufo, the ability even to turn your back on the principle, the human elemental feeling of Chayecha Kodmin L'Chaye Kavercha in some respect, because this is the true antidote to the Churban, cultivating a further sense of identification, achrayus, Avas Hashem, especially Ahavas Yisrael and Ahavas Klal Yisrael, a sense of total empathy and identity with each and every Jew and with the Jewish community. So that ultimately, Tisha B'Av, a terrible, sad day, is also a day which is a kiyum of Moed, in that it expresses these critical axiomatic principles. Small wonder that La'asid Lavo, it will turn also into a true simcha, precisely because of the themes that underpin it. May we soon witness the transformation of this complex moed of loss, Lishbor Bachurai, into a true moed of simcha, as is prophesied in Zechariah. And may this be a further catalyst for each and every one of us and for our community to rededicate and to intensify our commitment to V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha on an individual level, to Ahavas Yisrael, and to Ahavas HaMikdash on the national level.